it's so typical of the Americans, unfortunately, of the American foreign policy establishment. They use people, and when their usefulness is over, they throw them away in the most despicable and callous way imaginable. Now, it seems very clear that the war in Ukraine is going very, very badly for the Ukrainian armed forces. This is not to question the heroism or bravery of the men or their efforts. On the contrary, the fact that they've lasted so long before the Russian onslaught is a testament to their bravery. But the fact is, and this is something that was obvious from the very beginning of this war, the Russian army is simply bigger, better prepared, better equipped, better led, both militarily and politically. And so they are winning. They are winning decisively. Now, we are coming to the end of the Battle of the Donbass. At this time, the Russian army has chewed through all of the fortifications that the Ukrainian armed forces had developed over the past 8 years. And they are about to hit the Kramatorsk line, which is the last line of this battle, because it's been a series of lines that protect the Ukrainian armed forces and that have held back the Russians. And the Russians have been relentlessly chewing through these lines, and they're getting to the last one. And of course, by this point, the Ukrainian armed forces have been denigrated by the onslaught of the Russian armed forces. And the Russian armed forces are fresh and tidy and looking very good and very crisp because they're constantly rotated. Sometimes the Russians will put in a unit for barely a day of combat and then pull them out and replace them with fresh troops. And so this, of course, means that the Russians always have fresh, rested, well-equipped troops confronting a very weary, very exhausted Ukrainian armed force. And so the inevitability is arriving, which is the complete collapse of the Ukrainian armed forces, which I want to insist, it is not me besmirching in any way or belittling in any way the efforts of the Ukrainian armed forces. It's just the reality on the ground. The Russians are winning. Anybody who says otherwise is just fooling themselves. The HIMARS, which are these multiple rocket launch systems that everybody keeps talking about, this is wonder weapon, pie in the sky thinking. The number of HIMARS being sent to the Ukrainian front are just minimal, trivial. They've sent 20. What the Ukrainians would actually need to be combat effective is maybe 10 times, maybe 15 times that number. I'm talking 200 to 300 HIMARS, not 20. And on top of that, of the 20 that they've sent, the Russians have definitively destroyed at least 4, and possibly from accounts an additional 2 more as of today. It doesn't really matter. The truth is that the Russians are winning. And so what's going to happen is that, there will come a tipping point in this conflict where the Ukrainian armed forces will simply collapse. And when that happens, the Russian armed forces will sweep westward from the Donbass, from the Kherson area. They will sweep westward. The Donbass area, they will sweep towards Dnipropetrovsk, which is a city. When you're looking at the map of Ukraine, it's dead center. The Russians will sweep towards that city, and they will probably overrun it. It's the 3rd largest city in Ukraine. And in Kherson, to the south, which is just north of the Crimean Peninsula, they will probably attack Nikolaev and sweep westward towards Transnistria. They will probably ignore Odessa, because Odessa is a historically and for religious reasons a very important city to the Russians. And it's already been clear the Russians have telegraphed their intention of taking Odessa one way or the other. But it is unlikely that they will carry out an assault on the city because they don't want to damage it because of the historical importance that the city has. And so what they'll probably do is simply surround it. They will make a dash for Transnistria, cut off Odessa from the north, from Kiev, and just wait it out because time is on the Russian side. And so what has been increasingly clear is that the West is realizing 2 things. Number one, they're realizing that NATO cannot match the Russians. The Russians, in terms of their industrial output, in terms of the amount of artillery pieces and munitions, they simply outclass the West. And this has been pointed out by Western think tanks. The Western think tanks of the Royal Unified Society Institute, which is like the military think tank of Great Britain, there was a very interesting article called "The Return of Industrial Warfare," where it was basically pointed out that the West, because of its deindustrialization policies of the last 30 years, which has hurt the working classes of the West so badly, well, precisely because of this deindustrialization, the West does not have the industry to arm its armies, forgive the malapropism. And so, therefore, the West simply cannot compete. If they were to go in a head-to-head war with the Russians, they would run out of ammunition. The West would run out of ammunition in about 2 months with no possibility of resupply. The famous saying by Stalin that quantity has a quality all its own. It's very true of the current situation, of the current conflict. And so NATO, the West, is realizing they cannot fight against the Russians, so they won't, and the war is lost. And so it seems increasingly clear that the position of Zelensky in Kiev is becoming untenable. There have already been signs, excuse me, that his position is weakening with the West. And so I think what will happen is that the West will begin to slowly withdraw its support in terms of money, in terms of equipment. Please excuse me. Inflation here is rising, and you can see it in the exchange rate between the hryvnia, which is the Ukrainian currency, and the dollar and the euro. It's fallen 10% in the last 3 days. 3 days ago, you could buy a dollar for 37.5 to 38 hryvnias, and now it's at 41.5. So basically about almost 10% in 3 days, which means, of course, that the Ukrainian government, the Zelensky regime, is not getting the foreign currency necessary to keep the government of Ukraine afloat. And so, these are various signs that are showing that the West is withdrawing its support. And the National Security Advisor of the United States, a man named Jacob Sullivan, a man of extraordinary incompetence and stupidity, quite frankly, well, he has stated publicly that Zelensky should be concerned about his personal safety. Jake Sullivan is basically telegraphing the fact that the Americans are thinking of physically getting rid of Zelensky. And of course, they're couching it in the language that the Russians are going to do something to Zelensky, which has been a common pattern of the Western military political establishment, whereby they will often say that the Russians are planning to do something when it's in fact what they themselves are thinking of doing, and they're projecting it onto the Russians. This is a very common thing that people have noticed over the last year or so, where the Americans, the Europeans are thinking of something and they project it onto the Russians, when they themselves are the ones who are planning such a thing. I think that's why I believe, and I've said so publicly. Go ahead.
Yeah, you did say so publicly. I want to test that. It's worth the audience remembering that Zelensky is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian. His Ukrainian language is not that good. His native tongue is Russian. Number two, that Zelensky was elected on a peace platform. He was elected to make peace with Russia. And thirdly, of course, I want to test your proposition because, of course, the Americans, as the DM brothers could testify, if the Americans hadn't had them rubbed out in Vietnam, you can be useful for America for a time and then you can be killed. The Americans could kill Zelensky. The Russians could kill Zelensky. But much more likely is that people within his own regime would kill him, either so that they could fill their pockets in the way that Zelensky has filled his, or because they have some vision that the war can be won differently from that pursued by Zelensky. Explore those three possibilities, if you would.
Sure. Number one, it's never going to be the Russians, because the Russians, as many commentators have pointed out, they need Zelensky to be the one to sign the peace agreement, the ceasefire agreement, because the Russians see that eventually some ceasefire will have to be signed. And since Zelensky has so many people have validated Zelensky as the legitimate leader of Ukraine, the Russians need to have Zelensky sign that ceasefire agreement. If the Russians wanted to kill Zelensky, and I'm not saying anything that people don't know, they could have killed him on the first day of the special military operation. It would have been no trick at all, because they know exactly where he is pretty much at all times because of their intelligence, both human intelligence and signal intelligence. For the Russians, it would be no trick to kill Zelensky if they wanted to. The fact that he's alive means that the Russians want him alive. And it's very clear why, because they want him to be the man to sign the peace agreement. So it's not the Russians. Now, insofar as any internal coup that takes place to get rid of Zelensky and replace him would have to have the okay of the United States, not the Europeans. The Europeans are the chihuahuas in this story, okay? The big dog are the Americans, the people in the Pentagon and Foggy Bottom. The Foggy Bottom is where the State Department is. Well, those people are the ones who are supporting Zelensky. And any coup attempt against Zelensky would have to have the okay of the big dogs back in Washington. And so I don't think that, there is certainly a lot of palace intrigue, and there have been a lot of moves as of late of people getting replaced and then not replaced, fired and not fired. I'm talking specifically about the head of the SBU, the Ukrainian State Security Services, which the head of it was a childhood friend of Zelensky's, and he was fired by Zelensky. But then the next day, Zelensky walked it back and said, no, he wasn't fired. He was just suspended. That kind of palace intrigue, we will never know the truth. And trying to read the tea leaves and figure out what's going on there, it's a fool's errand, because there are too many variables. We don't know what's really going on. All we can see are what the Americans are saying. And that is much more clear. And when the Americans put out a signal that Zelensky should watch himself, that the Russians want to kill him, that's because the Americans are thinking that. See, the Russians have no interest in getting rid of Zelensky, because it would cause for the Russians many more problems. Whereas the Americans might be thinking along the following lines. They might be thinking, look, Ukraine is lost. If we have Zelensky and his military leadership killed in a missile strike that we ourselves do carry out, as we've done with other regimes, if we do it and we blame the Russians and we get the Western press on board with this story and blame it all on the Russians, and we punt the entire Ukraine nation onto Russia's lap, a decapitated nation with no president, no military leadership, and all of a sudden, all of these soldiers, all of them armed, you have chaos, civil chaos, like a situation that happened in Libya. And we punt this whole problem into the lap of the Russians. Well, now that would solve a lot of America's problems very neatly now, wouldn't it? Because it would effectively become a huge problem for the Russians logistically to bring some sort of civil order to the Ukrainian nation. Do recall, Ukraine is the size of France, the size of Texas. It's enormous. It's an enormous piece of country. So to occupy it, to pacify it, you would need at least 250,000 soldiers, if not more. And I'm talking just soldiers just to be policing the place, not like a war, just to keep social order, okay? And so the Americans, it seems realistic to me with these comments made by Jake Sullivan, it seems realistic to think that they are entertaining the idea of assassinating Zelensky and his military leadership, blame it on the Russians, deliberately cause all kinds of civil unrest and anarchy within Ukraine, and have this become a permanent problem for Russia. They did something essentially similar in Libya, whereby they manufactured the killing of Gaddafi and turned Libya into a complete basket case. I mean, we in the end of it, we literally have slave trading going on in the streets of Tripoli, for crying out loud. And all of Libya is just, divided up between various warlords that are constantly fighting one another in complete chaos, right? And we have the Syrian situation where the Americans have done their utmost to create civil unrest and civil chaos, because ultimately the United States is the empire of chaos, where chaos rules because chaos benefits the United States. So that kind of gameplay seems reasonable. That kind of approach, which in fact has happened just now in Sri Lanka, where the Americans, the American NGOs, non-governmental organizations, all these green non-governmental organizations, created the conditions where now you have civil chaos in Sri Lanka, and soon you are going to have famines in Sri Lanka, a complete catastrophe. But this plays into the geostrategic goals of the United States, because instead of trying to raise up the United States, they find it more convenient to pull everybody down. And that seems to me why it's reasonable to think at this time, things can change, of course, but it's reasonable to think that the Americans are the ones planning to get rid of Zelensky, blame it on the Russians, and let